Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Lives, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Stephanie Cresson from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm a junior studying psychology in UW-Madison College of Letters and Science. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce UW-Madison's Arboretum Native Plant Garden Curator, Susan Carpenter. Native plants are the basis of sustainable, diverse, and beautiful gardens supporting pollinators, beneficial insects, and wildlife. These gardens thrive without fertilizers, pesticides, mowing, or supplemental watering. Today, Susan will be sharing garden examples, plant sources, and practical tips for garden care. Susan Carpenter is the Native Plant Garden Curator and Gardener at the Wisconsin Arboretum since 2003. She has worked with students and community volunteers to maintain and monitor a 4-acre garden representing the plant communities of southern Wisconsin. She also leads a conservation project that involves students and the public in documenting and studying native bumblebees, including the endangered rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis. A graduate of Stanford University, Susan earned her MS in Botany and MS in Science Education here at UW-Madison. Please welcome Susan Carpenter.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. And I am glad to be here today to talk about native plants. This is a good topic for a day like today when native plants would be on our mind. So wintry today. So let's look at growing things and pictures of gardens for the rest of this hour. I want to go over a few things that are features or characteristics of native plant gardens and landscapes. And these are just some general features. And I want to go over them because they have in common, all of these landscapes and gardens would have in common these features. And when I say gardens today, and I say your garden, I mean really all gardens. Our garden here at the Arboretum and your garden, say, that you might have at home. Also, gardens that are community gardens or civic gardens, civic buildings, teaching gardens that might be at schools, or just common areas of gardens where people come together and work together on gardening. So all of these spaces are appropriate, and I would say very much very important for native plants and for native landscapes to exist in and for us to foster. So I'll be using gardens and your gardens very generally that way, and just imagine the garden that you'll be working on or that you're already working on in the community. So these gardens are diverse and healthy, and diverse refers to the organisms that are in the garden. So we'll have plants, animals, insects, birds, all the different creatures, fungi, bacteria, all the different creatures that would live in a garden, and quite a bit of diversity, meaning many different kinds of organisms at all those different levels. And healthy refers to land health. So when we talk about land health, we refer to the soil, the water, the plants, and the animals, and we think about that collective health of those organisms that have evolved together and live together and really have relationships with each other. These gardens are full of life. So one thing you notice when you plant a native plant garden, if you're going from a construction zone, as we did here at the Arboretum, or if you're going from a lawn or other kind of area like that, you find pretty soon after the plants are in that many other organisms are drawn to these plants. And it really is kind of an example of, if you build it, they will come. It doesn't take too long, and then you're really seeing a lot more life in the area. These are sustainable gardens. So they are sustainable. By that I mean that they are mostly, in the case of the plants, perennials, and they are, so they're living from year to year, and they're kind of interacting over time. So prairie plants, for example, and woodland plants for that matter, are establishing root systems, and those root systems are growing and growing underground. The above ground part of the plants may be getting larger, it may be getting thicker, maybe getting the clumps of plants may be getting bigger. There'll be seeding and growing by underground stems called rhizomes, and all different ways that these gardens maintain themselves across time. They are managed with low inputs, and by low inputs I mean the things like mowing. We don't mow. We rarely do any supplemental watering after the initial planting period. We don't use any fertilizers or herbicides, except in very, very rare cases we might have to spot treat a very persistent weed that we might be dealing with. And we don't use any insecticides, and that's quite important as you think about those food webs and those different organisms that are depending on these plants. These plants are in a native plant garden or landscape are of the place. So the gardens are designed using plants that have evolved in that location, that general region for thousands and thousands of years, and they live together in community. So they really identify where you are. If you're in southern Wisconsin, in contrast to northern Wisconsin, you would be able to recognize where you were by looking at the plants of that ecological region. They are adapted to the climate, the local climate and soils of the area. And so the variations in climate are also something that's not foreign to them. They can withstand drought very well. They can withstand cold to some extent, heat. So these are the plants that are the best adapted to the area where they are found. And then soils, of course, vary from place to place, even within a 4-acre garden, I can tell you that. And so these plants are adapted to the soils. The gardens are always changing, and this is something that's very important from the gardener's point of view, to be ready and to be looking and to be willing to work with the changes that come about. The biggest change in the garden that we take care of here at the Arboretum has been shade, because it started out as basically a very open area. Small trees were planted, and 20 years later, there's quite a bit more shade than there was then. And they're fascinating. These gardens are so interesting. Once you are working with the plants, you'll have questions, you'll learn things that maybe no one else knows. You'll be able to share those things with others. So just the questions that come up and the things that you learn and what you wonder after you've learned something are just, there's endless interest there. So today I want to go over some native plant garden examples. I'll draw those from the Arboretum's garden here. And with each example, I want to point out something that will apply to your garden. And again, the broader case of your garden, either your home garden, or if you're thinking about a garden, thinking about starting a garden, or you're working with others on a community garden. These would all be things that I hope are useful to you as you go through that process. Then I've had questions about design ideas and plant sources, and there's a whole range of ways to think about design. So we'll go through that quickly. And plant sourcing, I won't go into the details, but I will give you some resources mention some resources where you can find out where you can come up with, where you'll be able to find some design ideas and plant sourcing. And then I'll go through some sustainable gardening practices, things that we have found are very helpful to keep in mind for taking care of your native plant garden. And this is a picture on the screen. You can see the endangered rusty patch bumblebee. That is a bee that we learned was in the garden, and we have really gone into a lot of detail learning about it and being able to share a lot of that information with others. And then at the bottom there, you see a panorama of our garden. So we have you can see established gardens, some of those trees about 20 years old, and then a brand new garden that we just developed this summer. So it's only less than 6 months old, and I'm looking really forward to seeing it next spring. So here's the overview of the native plant garden and its surrounding areas at the University of Wisconsin Madison Arboretum. And this just reminds us that the native plant garden exists, as all of our gardens do, within a context, physical context. Here we are located right at the Arboretum Visitor Center with the Curtis Prairie to the south and the horticultural collection of Longenecker Horticultural Gardens to the north. And those two areas are both historical areas here at the Arboretum. They were both, the plantings in both of them began in 1935. So we have our history right surrounding us. And then, of course, our garden is not walled off from those areas, and the organisms, the animals, the bees, the birds go from place to place, and even the plants go from place to place, as we'll find out when we're weeding, monitoring our garden. We're also in the context of the city of Madison. We have about 14 or 15 neighborhoods surrounding us, and certainly we are in a social context as well, with our many visitors, our many volunteers, our students, of course, and all the people who do research here at the Arboretum. So our neighbors are important to us, and they're also taking up practices of gardening that will bring pollinators back and forth from this garden out to their gardens. So that's an important thing to remember. You're always within that context. So we're going to start with the spring, early in the spring. So maybe let's think about April and May. And if we were out in the garden in a dry or dry mesic prairie, we would see two plants that are blooming first off. These are the very first things to bloom in the prairie in the spring. And I'll just stop for a moment to mention what mesic means. If we think about dry and wet areas, so kind of this continuum of moisture, mesic would be right in the middle. So if I say dry mesic, I mean slightly to the dry side of the middle of that moisture range, and that's a soil moisture range. So these are short little plants, but they're beautiful. They are pollinated by bumblebees, and these are the early bumblebees. So often it's the queen bumblebees that will visit these plants and come up underneath the flower and shake the flower, vibrate the flower with their wings, and shake the pollen down out of the flower, and then gather the pollen into a pollen basket on her legs here, and that pollen is going to go back to the nest. She flies back to the nest, and that will be the food for the young, for the earliest bees that are developing in the annual colony. So these are very important. It's important to have the early resources in your garden. So something blooming very early is important, and this could be a tree, it could be these small plants, just depending on what your site will permit. Early blooming resources. And those plants would be found in an area like this, which is a short grass planting. So here in the foreground, we have a short grass planting, which is just four of our native grasses that are that stay down below 2.5 feet, 3 feet, something like that when they're fully mature. They're all bunch grasses. So we have the June grass here. It's already bloomed in June, and little blue stem, side oats, grama grass, and the prairie drop seed. So those are the four grasses that are there, but then also other plants are grown within them, other little flowering plants, and that changes from time to time throughout the season. So in the spring, early spring, we might have the prairie smoke and the shooting stars blooming here. Later, of course, you can see some black-eyed Susans, there's some bellwort, and other plants. And that's a nice size of garden. People do appreciate this for some of the home gardening where you want lower profile plants. So you can plan a garden like this for an area that's narrow or kind of close to a path, or maybe you just want to be able to see over it, or traffic is an issue, so you want to be able to see traffic. So a short profile garden like this is very nice for that situation. And then our mesic prairie garden, in this case, is modeled after tall grass prairie, so it has quite a bit more height to it. And we're looking at it in the spring, so we're seeing the purple there of the spiderwort. The yellow is just the beginning of the oxeye, a sunflower starting to bloom. There's some alum root blooming here, not a very conspicuous flower, but a lovely plant, and some grasses blooming, some cool season grasses there. That's blue joint grass. So you can see from this picture just a lot of variety in the shapes of the plants, the different bloom times, obviously, and the colors, but also just there's a mix of grasses. There's a mix of grasses, and then the plants that are not grasses are called forbs. And so those are all combined together in this planting. And we don't have any particular organization to it as far as height, tall ones in back or anything like that. We're really mixing them through for a naturalistic look. So this reminds us that in our gardens, we'd like to have a variety of plants. When we planted this garden originally, we had 70 species, at least 70 species of prairie plants that went into this garden. And that's a good amount for a fairly small area. And it's really developed well over time. And then we move out. We have these our gardens that are in the open are our prairie gardens for the most part, but we also have some gardens that are plants in an understory, as you see here, with trees above, and those are savanna plantings. So we have 2 savanna gardens, and this is the black oak savanna. And here you can see again, it's seen at that same time of year as the prairie, with the spiderwort, that purple, the alum root. There's some lupin blooming in this garden. And here, what I'd like to point out for you is that most of our home or built environments are similar to a savanna in a way. We have kind of scattered trees, partial shade. And so a lot of the savanna plants are suitable, very suitable for these kinds of settings because they have either a wide amplitude of light conditions that each species can tolerate, or within the mix of species, there are some that do better in shade and some that do better in sun. So with the mix, you get good coverage. One other thing I like to point out at this in this photo is the edge, because here we have the lawn, we have a curved edge as it goes along the edge of the garden. It's not a straight line. That gives a good naturalistic feel. But the fact that the lawn is mowed right up to an edge that's a very distinct edge can be important if you're gardening in an area where maybe your neighbors aren't quite 100% sold on your native plantings. This is what is known as a cue to care. And it means that you are signaling an intention that you have your lawn and you have a garden bed adjacent. And it's a little thing, but it can be important just for the appearance of that intention. And in our bur oak savanna, so roughly around the same time of year. So now we're in June, May, June period. We have 3 of our understory plants growing together right here. And we have the wild geranium, that's this purple one. The yellow is a golden Alexander, a member of the carrot family. And then this is the wild columbine over here, a member of the buttercup family. And so I just want to contrast for you here the columbine and the geranium. They grow in the same site. You can see that here. But as your garden matures, and this was a picture taken at a time when the tree, as you can see, there was a tree there that wasn't very large. But at that time, when the plants were first put in, they were all kind of on equal footing. But as the garden fills in, and as you can see, there's other species here that are filling in. The columbine is not each plant is not a long-lived plant necessarily. And they do they need to reseed themselves over time. So they don't do well if there's a lot of fill-in the garden. They don't persist for a long time. where they will persist is at the edge of the garden, because there's more disturbance there. Or if you purposely make some disturbance and scatter some seed there, or the plant scatters some seed, then that will be a spot where it will be able to germinate and grow and create more columbines. The geranium, on the other hand, is kind of just a slow and steady plant. It stays in clusters like this. It does respond well if you have if it gets a little too shady. It does respond well to, say, removing some limbs or maybe a shrub or something that would give it a little bit more light. But it persists for a long time in the area. And then in the most deep shade areas that we have, this would be under maples, under basswoods, is the deepest shade that there is. So there we find the true woodland plants. And we see here a great example of a wonderful woodland ground cover. This is wild ginger. So around the same time that we've been talking about this kind of wonderful springtime period, we have the ferns emerging here. These are maidenhair ferns, and we have the ginger fully leafed out. And actually what we can't see on this ginger is it's in full bloom at this time as well. The flowers are small red little flowers that lie on the ground, and they're pollinated, and the seeds are dispersed by crawling insects. So they're kind of hard to see if you're just looking at the garden broadly, but if you get down there and really poke around, you'll find the small flowers and the small seeds. And we do find this plant, even though it's best suited for deep shade and or very heavy partial shade, we do find seedlings of it way out in the open. So we do know those insects are carrying them out to other areas. And if it reaches a good spot, then it can start up from those seeds that were carried out by a small insect. So now we're moving along in the year just a little bit, and I'm going to highlight milkweed. It's such a beautiful plant and such an important plant, and also so important in some of the relationships that we are familiar, that maybe most of you are familiar with. But just to show you a little bit about the variety of milkweeds, and I know a lot of people are growing milkweed, so just so that you are aware, there's a milkweed for pretty much every occasion, every location. And they do differ from each other in terms of where they will grow and what they look like, of course. So we have 12 native species of milkweed. Some of them are quite rare, so we won't run across them in the garden, but there's about half a dozen that are pretty common and commonly available in the trade. One of them is butterfly weed here to the left, and it can vary in color from this kind of reddish orange here that you see on this slide to a bright orange. We've even had a plant come up in the garden with a yellow pigment. It's the same plant, but just lacking the red. So it can have those natural variations in color. And in this case, it really looks pretty with that white sage, which is a member of the sunflower family in our dry mesic prairie garden. So butterfly weed does well in medium to dry soils, and it's a cluster. The plant is a bunch of stems. It's not a rhizomatous. It doesn't travel with multiple stems, to form a big group of plants. It spreads by seed. And red milkweed is similar in that way. Single plant, a cluster of stems at one point, and then it seeds itself. But it does well where there's more soil moisture. So here it is kind of a pinkish color, rose colored. It has several common names, but red milkweed is one of them. And this is one in a rain garden. So you do want to incorporate plants that are whatever sites you have, you want to be able to incorporate plants that are suited to those sites. And if you are interested in milkweeds, you have a lot to choose from then. And then looking at this picture, we've moved on in the year. We're coming into the middle of the summer now. So we are seeing a different set of plants blooming. And then this is in our wet mesic prairie garden. So it's a little bit more moist. It receives some of the rainwater coming across it that falls on our visitor center. And so this would be these would be some of the species that you could grow if you had a drain spout or a drainage area or low-lying area that gains a little bit more moisture than your other areas that you're gardening in. So here we have the blazing star, the prairie blazing star with these purple spikes just starting to bloom there at the very top. And that bloom starts at the top and works its way down. And then the Culver's root is the white one with the spikes, individual flowers there blooming on those spikes. And the prairie phlox is the little tiny pink one. And the Joe Pye weed is a branching one that's just starting to grow. And this is actually a very tall accent plant just on its way to becoming pretty tall. And then the blue joint grass is this grass back here that's already bloomed. It's got kind of the feathery seed heads, releasing its seeds by this time. And then many more plants. You can, again, here you see the diversity. You see that there's always something blooming or several things blooming at any given time. And that is an important support for insects and for birds and for other animals as well. So you're thinking about, if you're thinking about the food web, of course, the birds who are nesting may be relying on caterpillars that are eating the plants. So you be aware that everything is connected, and we're not even really knowledgeable of what all those connections are, but I'm sure you will discover some for yourself as you garden. And this is an example of a garden where it looks like we planted one thing. So we're in July now, and this is what may happen as you grow native plants, especially in the early stages. If you're planting out a large bed, you'll have certain species that do very, very well in the early years, and then it kind of settle down, if you will, in later years. But right now, at this point of the year, we can see this is filled with bee balm. And bee balm is Monarda fistulosa. It's the native one, so we see the lavender color here. This is called bee balm for a reason. And if we were to go to this location with our cameras and be interested in our bumblebees, we would find probably, here at the Arboretum, we might find 6 or 7 different species of bumblebees on these plants, just in this one spot that I'm showing in the picture. So I guess my message for your garden is not to be startled if something like this happens. Be a little bit patient and see how it plays out. But in the meantime, be sure to take advantage of it in terms of a monitoring opportunity, or in some cases, you might want to be making some flower arrangements or something like that if you feel as though you have an excess of a certain plant. But as time goes on, if you came back to this garden another month after this picture was taken, you would see a different species. You would see other things in bloom and other things that would be that would catch your interest. So rain gardens is something that we have 2 of them here at the Arboretum, and it's really something that has grown in the last decade or more. People have grown an interest in rain gardens. People have been installing rain gardens. We have large scale, small scale, and everything in between. And these are very important if you think about how they can function as an infiltration area, but a beautiful infiltration area for rain that's coming off of a pavement, off of roof lines, through gutters, and off of the non-permeable surfaces of our built environment. And I just love to show this little example because it connects so well with that idea of dependence. So here we have the rain garden. The larger picture there is our smaller rain garden, and it is in bloom in the middle of the summer here. We see this pink flower back here is the red milkweed. And so here's the close-up of the milkweed. And we know, of course, that monarchs depend on milkweed. We're always encouraged to see monarchs in our gardens. We have monitoring going on in the native plant garden, and I know many people are involved with monitoring monarchs and their egg-laying caterpillars, chrysalis, and so forth in their own gardens. But the monarch depends on milkweed because it has to lay its eggs on milkweed, and the larvae require milkweed for their food. That's the only food that they can eat. But milkweed has a very specialized pollination system, and monarchs and butterflies are not a very effective pollinator of milkweed. So in order for milkweed to persist, we need pollinators who can do that job. And usually those are, for the most part, are bumblebees and large wasps and larger insects that can pull out those small packets of pollen. And you can see them here on this bumblebee. These golden structures here are the packets of pollen, the pollinia from the milkweed. And then the bumblebee visits another milkweed, and that's how you will see the pods developing on milkweeds. So these organisms are connected together through this very key plant that the monarchs require. And of course, milkweed is producing a tremendous amount of nectar as it blooms, and many, many, many insects are using that. As we move on into the late summer, here's the big rain garden. This is 30 meters across. It's over 100 kinds of plants, and you can see a few of them in bloom at this point, including this lovely bottled gentian, which is a very special plant that is in full bloom here in the picture and is bumblebee pollinated. They have to force their way into those flowers through this little opening. The petals open and unpleat, and then they shut again, pleat, closed again, and the bee is inside, and then it pollinates the flower and it pops back out. So these are very lovely plants, so growing in kind of a wet mesic situation that a rain garden can provide. And then at the end of the year, we have our warm season grasses in their colorful fall colors, the switchgrass, the Indian grass, big blue stem, little blue stem, and really blooming around at that time. We have our asters, just dozens of kinds of asters and dozens of kinds of goldenrods. And of course, the seeds are spreading and dispersing at that time of year. So I want to mention a little bit about plant selection or design here. Here we have a diagram, which is actually the design on the right there is the design of one section of our garden. And of course, we can't read that, but this shows, you can see the colored dots and the colored areas. Those are the plants, and they're color coded with that long list. So you can see it's got quite a bit of diversity. You can see a building in the garden plan, and here on the north side of the building, it looks that you can just tell from the colors that the plants here are much different than the plants that are planted in the southern side of the building, and that just has to do with the microclimates of the location itself. So this is like the broadest kind of big picture design, but we don't often have a professional garden designer at our disposal. So here we would like probably to get some resources for our own areas and maybe something on a smaller scale. So some planting designs, Wild Ones, the organization that supports native plant gardening, has developed for different areas of the country some planting designs. So you can find the area that's most appropriate for you and take a look at those designs. UW Extension and the DNR both have on their websites have excellent rain garden resources. So to get a rain garden plan or rain garden lists, those are really excellent resources. Native plant nurseries will also have great resources on their websites, and they will talk about the plant mixes and the plant species that will be appropriate for different situations. And the DNR has a consultant list. So if you feel as though you would like some professional consulting, there are some organizations and companies that are available for either a one-time consult, or perhaps you'd like them to do the whole job. It's just a matter of budget and timing and what you would like to accomplish. Another approach, and I really do encourage people to do this, is to think of the space as an area, think of your space as an area and look at it with a little bit of a critical eye and see if some of your native plants or some of your plants are ornamentals and you don't see any, and if you don't see any birds or any insects or any life around them, if you feel like it, you could substitute a native plant for that plant. And so this is kind of a more gradual approach. It allows you to take a more incremental approach and allows you to kind of really look at what your garden looks like now and what changes you could make over time. Douglas Tallamy's books are helpful in this regard, especially for tree species and woody species. And then there are other resources that would be available for looking at herbaceous plants. But really the most common way I think that people like to do this and get started is to start with a particular gardening focus or just a few favorite plants. So maybe you love hummingbirds and you'd like to have a hummingbird garden and you can build around that. Or you want to have a butterfly garden and you can build around that. Or you would like to encourage endangered bumblebees or even common bumblebees. So or maybe you like the beautiful red of this cardinal flower and the wonderful scent of the mountain mint. And you just start with some favorite plants and find a place where you can grow them, hopefully in your location, or maybe a garden that you help care for, and just build out from that. Once you have success with a plant growing in a location, then you can continue to add other plants that grow with that plant. With pollinator gardening, that's a good example of one of these kind of focused gardenings. There are lots of good resources. The Pollinator Partnership has planting guides for the different ecoregions. If you start with the Rusty Patch Bumblebee plant list from Fish and Wildlife Service, you'll encourage all the other bumblebees with those plants as well, plus a lot of other insects. And again, the Xerces Society has a lot of good resources on their website, and native plant nurseries. So here are some general tips and principles to remember and to kind of keep in mind as you move forward with your gardening. To maximize the number and diversity of native plants in your landscape, see how the understory of this woodland garden in the spring is really filled in. There really aren't open gaps and open spaces, and this speaks back to that idea of making sure that your landscape is as full as it can be of many kinds of plants and then just multiple individuals of plants that do well in that spot. And this is key, matching the plants to the particular site conditions, the sun, the soil type, and the moisture. And I know that some of these things would be obvious. We might have an area here which is the north side of a building, and the trees and shrubs haven't quite leafed out. So we know this is going to be shadier and cooler and a little more moist than areas away from this spot. And here we're in the wide open sun area with a deeper area in the middle here. So we know that we would need plants that could stand moisture and also plants that could be more adapted to drier spots. But some of this matching isn't something you know ahead of time. It's something that you experiment and find out as you go. So I'd encourage you to do some little experiments and try things. Include a seasonal sequence of flowering. I mentioned this before. So a garden with half the garden looks like this in the summer, and in the fall it still has something blooming till the very end of the season, the goldenrod and aster season. And different flower forms, so that you have pollinators that visit here, and here's a pollinator that is having to spring that flower open. That's the Baptisia flower. Plant species that are native to your area for the most part. Some of the cultivars and variations of the native species are attractive to insects and other garden life, but not all. So here's another place where observation, experimenting, and if you if you know the native will, if you can have access to the native one, you know that one will be suitable because it's been evolving with your native insects for so long. Avoid pesticides, especially the systemic insecticides. So these are insecticides which are used in seed treatment and as the plants are developing as a soil drench as they're being produced in their little pots in commercial production. And you want to avoid those. So the problem with them is the systemic insecticides go into the plant tissue, and they do protect the plant from insects that would feed on the leaves, but the compounds are also within the pollen, within the nectar, within the plant altogether. So any insect that's using that plant, including insects that we find desirable or that are beneficial insects, would be harmed by those insecticides, and they're not always labeled. So these plants that you see on this tray, this would be what you would pick up if you ordered from the Friends of the Arboretum plant sale, which starts in January. These are from a native plant nursery, so clearly they are not treated with systemic insecticide. But if you're buying from other growers and you're buying from other unlabeled places, you might want to check and see if those have been treated and avoid them if possible. Here's where my volunteers always tease me about this recommendation, because I'm asking to think about the areas that are not quite as kept up or manicured as our gardens traditionally might be. So we incorporate logs or rocks, retain leaf litter, and keep buffer areas kind of going. Maybe pile up some of your trimmed material and leave it off to the side. I had a visitor once who told me she arranged her trimmed material into like art pieces by tying them up and putting them around in her garden, so that anything that was overwintering or taking refuge in that material would be able to emerge and not be thrown out with as sometimes we have in the fall. We talked about the soil being part of this system for sure, and it is an important place for nesting. It's also an important place for fungi, and so I do recommend avoiding landscape fabric, really, really heavy, thick layers of mulch or rocks used as mulch, because then the soil is not available to it's not available to plants for sure, and that's so. I know we use it to avoid weeds, but we do get to weed. There's a lot of things that we don't have to do with native plants, but we do get to weed. So I just recommend this because it is much more, you're kind of following nature in this regard with our gardening. And then we leave the plant material standing over the winter. So this is what it looks like in the fall, and in the winter it looks like this. And you can see that our visitors here made a trail of their own. So I do like to leave the material up. It does signal that there's a garden there. And if it was all trimmed down after a snowfall, it would just look like an expanse. And our visitors usually don't walk through the gardens when they can see that there's an area that's left untrimmed. And this is my last recommendation for gardening. And it seems a little odd because it isn't just about the garden itself, but it's about what you're learning and what you can share. So I do recommend that you document what you are learning in your garden with photography, with writing, with poetry, whatever forms you use, and then have a chance to share it. And there are some projects listed here that are mostly photo-based or just simple observation-based projects. So Bumblebee Brigade is the Bumblebee Project with the DNR, and we're gathering a lot of great information from photos that people are submitting to that project and documenting not only the rare bumblebees, but also the common bumblebees of the state. iNaturalist is another photo-based project, and you can explore that. Very easy to use and very easy to set up projects. So your own garden could be a project in that platform. eBird, as you're gardening, you may be making good observations of birds and their nesting and their presence in your garden and what they're eating and what they're using. And eBird is a good way to capture those observations. And then Journey North is capturing migration information. Monarchs and hummingbirds are two of the big groups, and that is a citizen science project based here at the Arboretum. So anyone can join that and anyone can make observations. And with that, I just have thanks to a lot of people who have been so central in everything that's we've done here at the gardens, and to all of you for your interest, and to our funders, both for the native plant garden itself and for our bumblebee conservation work with the citizen-based monitoring program. And with that, I will take questions if there are any.
Great, Susan, thank you so much. And thanks for bringing a little warmth into an otherwise day today. So we're really happy to have you here. We do have people posting questions. So hello, everybody. Fran Paleo-Moyer, Badger Talks producer. We're talking with Susan Carpenter from the UW Arboretum. So let's see. We had posted out here asking for people's thoughts on their favorite native plants. So please feel free to add to the chat. Jen Morris-Fodden says a favorite is Queen of the Prairie, or the fire plant, she thinks it's called. Are you familiar with that one?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So let's see. Victoria Call is asking, I would like to make one of my flower beds into a butterfly garden. Where can I get milkweed seeds? And for that matter, native plant seeds in general. Is that something people can just gather from the wild, or how do they go about that?
Well, I would say if she's starting out, it depends a little bit on how big the area is, but one good approach would be to look into those native plant nursery websites, because they'll often have, especially for pollinators right now, it's the last 10 years or so, pollinator gardening has just taken off. So it's very popular. And a lot of the nurseries have responded by creating mixes, lists, and seed mixes, sets of plants that grow together well. So the main thing would be to figure out what type of area you have. Is it dry? Is it sunny? Does it get a lot of moisture? What type of soil does it have? And a good way to figure that out is what's growing there now. What grows well there now. That would give you a lot of good clues. Then usually if you have a small enough area, say it's just a flower bed that's a manageable area, it's a good idea to plant some plants, some small plants. And if you plant those in the spring, then by the end of the summer, you'll be surprised how large they are. But you could plant some plants, and then you could put seed down from a seed mix for butterflies, and then the seeds would start growing and the plants would be growing ahead of them, but you would have more of a mix at that point. And then, of course, once you've got a few plants going, then you can harvest your own seeds.
Ah, gotcha. But really, those native plant nurseries are probably the go-to.
That's a good source because they've organized their offerings that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, super. Pat Hallquist says, I'm going to help plant a small pollinator garden this spring. The plot currently has landscape fabric. Should I remove all of that?
That would probably be best. And actually, that could be a good site preparation method, because if the landscape fabric comes off and there's nothing growing, and it's been effective, there's nothing really growing there, then you might have a fairly good weed-free bed. You don't be surprised when the soil's exposed to get some weeds coming up. But that's again another good reason to start with some small plants, because you could weed around them, and then as they get bigger, they'll shade around and fewer weeds will take hold.
Great. Ellen Hills asks, I planted an Aronio chokeberry bush. It seems that birds wait until spring to eat the berries. Is that a correct observation? I seem to have spring and summer mulberries covered, and any non-tree recommendations for autumn and winter.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting observation. I have an Aronia myself at home, and I noticed the same thing. So what happens with some of the species of fruit producing shrubs is they're not the first choice of the birds. So the birds will eat their first choices first, and then they will gradually be eating the things that aren't so special to them. But some good first choice plants, the one that I think of immediately in the shrubs is dogwood, gray dogwood, because it has a very, very high fat berry. It's prolific in producing berries. And here we have some shrubs that are, say, maybe 6 or 7 feet tall. And the turkeys come through and eat all the berries off the lower level. And then the small birds come above and eat the berries off of the upper levels. And you can't, after the birds have come through that first round, you don't find any more berries on that one. Then they go to the winter berries. Then they go to the aronia. And the other species. I'm oversimplifying, but
well, that makes sense. They have palates just like.
So I would say, I would say gray dogwood would be something to consider for her to cover that kind of later summer. Maybe a viburnum, nanny berry might be another choice.
So are any of these plants endangered? Are there ones that you recommend people plant because they are sort of fizzling away?
Well, the ones that are available in the commercial trade are not endangered, and they're easy to grow and they're easy to propagate, which is why they're in the commercial trade. Some of the wild plants are not quite as, like if we went to a native prairie, we would find plants there that you could never get in the commercial trade simply because they're not kind of as appealing to the gardening public, or they're harder to grow, or they're more rare, or they have special seed germination requirements or special habitat requirements. Generally, we don't grow. I think I maybe only have one species here in the garden that is a threatened species or an endangered species in Wisconsin. And there are some special guidelines about that. So you work with the DNR to have, to notify that you're growing them or that kind of thing. So it's a little more complicated. I think maybe this question is kind of getting at the conservation question, which is how can I help with conservation? And that's a question I get a lot. And I think how you help with conservation is if we can recover a lot of our built landscapes around our homes, schools, businesses, public buildings, etc., with native plants, we're actually doing there actually is a large conservation value to that. We know bees are declining, songbirds are declining, monarchs are declining, et cetera, et cetera. So where we can, if we do these practices, we will be having a conservation impact, just in a very local way.
Very important. Susan Carpenter, thanks so much for joining us today and for wrapping up our 2021 series of Badger Talks Live. It was great having you here.
Thank you so much.
Well, so that does conclude 2021 for Badger Talks Live. We've presented 40 talks this year on every subject under the sun. And we hope that you have learned as much as we have. I want to give a special thanks to Anthony and the True Productions team for all of their great work in producing these talks, and to Ben Rush, who handles our podcast. Please do check out the podcast. You did chat with Susan leading up to this talk as well. You can find that on our badgertalks.wisc.edu website. You can also sign up for our email list there, so you're the first to know about the upcoming spring talks. Consider a donation to Badger Talks, and you can also search the roster of over 400 faculty and staff at UW-Madison who have signed up to give talks around the state talking about topics that are important to you in your communities. We will return on Tuesday, January 25th at noon. And we're going to be welcoming Bridget Bowden, who's a Wisconsin Public Radio Special Projects reporter. And she's going to be talking about their new podcast called Mapped Out. And it's a new public radio project that looks at redistricting in Wisconsin, an important topic and a timely topic coming up. Thanks so much for tuning in. Have a great holiday, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in January.